The moment I walked into that ballroom, I heard her say it. Madison Caldwell, my brother's perfect fiancée, leaning toward her bridesmaids with a glass of champagne in her manicured hand. Her whisper was loud enough to carry across the room, and I know she meant it that way. Oh, great! The stinky country girl is here. Her friends giggled like a pack of hyenas in designer dresses. Madison didn't even bother to look at me when she said it. I was that insignificant to her. Just some embarrassment that crawled out of a small town to ruin the aesthetic of her perfect engagement party. What Madison didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I signed the deed to this hotel 3 years ago, the Monarch Hotel. Every chandelier above her head, every piece of silverware she was eating with, every square inch of Italian marble beneath her overpriced heels belonged to me. And by the end of tonight, that whisper was going to cost her everything she ever wanted. My name is Hannah Price. I didn't react right away. I didn't stiffen. I didn't turn. I didn't do any of the things people like Madison wait for when they throw words like knives, because when you grow up being underestimated, you learn something early. Your reaction is the reward. So I stood there for half a second longer than necessary, letting the insult settle into the room, letting it land exactly where she wanted it to land. I could feel the eyes flicking toward me, curious, assessing, judging, trying to decide what category I fit into. Out of place, too casual, too quiet, not worth much thought. That judgment used to hurt. Years ago, it would have crawled under my skin and stayed there, buzzing, reminding me of every time I'd been told I wasn't quite enough, not polished enough, not impressive enough, not the one people were proud to claim. But tonight, it didn't sting. Tonight, it amused me, because the truth was standing directly above her head, hanging in crystal and gold, humming softly with the sound of money she didn't understand. The truth was beneath her feet, set into marble imported from Italy, paid for with contracts she'd never see and signatures she'd never know existed. The truth was that Madison Caldwell was hosting her dream engagement party inside a building she didn't own, surrounded by staff who worked for me, drinking champagne purchased through accounts that required my approval, and she had no idea. I took another step into the ballroom, slow and unhurried, the way you move when you don't need permission to exist somewhere. Music swelled from the band near the stage, something elegant and forgettable, chosen to sound expensive rather than meaningful. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. This wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. Madison thrived on performances. She finally turned her head just enough to glance at me, her eyes skimming over my boots, my jacket, the absence of anything loud or logo covered. Her smile sharpened, not wide, not warm, just precise. The kind of smile meant to remind someone of their place without saying a word. I recognized that smile instantly. I'd been on the receiving end of it my entire life. Across the room, my brother Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting lightly at her back, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. He looked proud, nervous, hopeful in a way that made my chest tighten despite myself. He looked like a man who thought he had finally done something right, something that would make our family nod instead of sigh. He caught my eye for just a moment, hesitated, then offered a half-smile that carried more obligation than affection. The polite acknowledgement you give someone you don't quite know how to include. That part hurt more than Madison's insult ever could. But again, I didn't react. I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people uncomfortable when they expect noise. It makes them fill the gaps with their own assumptions. And Madison had already assumed everything she needed to assume about me, that I was harmless, that I was poor, that I was temporary. I let her believe it. I walked farther into the room, passing tables draped in linen that cost more than my first car. The scent of fresh flowers, orchids, peonies, something rare enough to justify the expense, hung heavy in the air. Guests milled about in clusters, laughter rising just a little too loudly, like people reminding each other how good their lives were supposed to be. This was Madison's world, a world built on appearances, on curated perfection, on never letting the cracks show. She had no idea she was standing inside mine. I paused near the edge of the ballroom, letting the noise wash over me. Somewhere behind the walls, my control systems hummed quietly, cameras recording, staff moving with trained efficiency, schedules running exactly as planned. The Monarch Hotel didn't function on chaos or whim. It functioned on structure, foresight, and control. All things Madison mistook for weakness when she didn't see them advertised. I caught my reflection briefly in one of the mirrored columns lining the room. Nothing about me screamed wealth. Nothing begged for attention. And that was exactly how I liked it. Real money doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. Madison laughed at something one of her friends said, tossing her head back just enough to make sure people were watching. The sound carried artificial, polished. She had perfected the art of being admired without being known, and by the end of the night, that would be the first thing to shatter, because some lessons can't be whispered. Some lessons need a room full of people and nowhere to hide. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, not from nerves but from anticipation. There was a difference. Nervousness came from uncertainty. Anticipation came from knowing exactly how something was going to end. I didn't know every detail yet. I didn't know every turn the night would take. But I knew this. Madison Caldwell thought she had won something tonight. She thought she had claimed a future, secured a family, cemented her place. She thought I was a footnote. And in a few hours, when the music stopped and the lights shifted and the truth came out in a way she couldn't smile her way through, she was going to understand a very simple rule I learned back in a town she would never bother to remember. You can look down on someone all you want. Just make sure they don't own the ground you're standing on. Millbrook wasn't the kind of town people put on postcards unless they were trying to be ironic. It had one main road, two diners that hated each other for reasons nobody could remember anymore, and a grocery store where the cashier knew what you were buying before you reached the counter because she'd watched you pick it off the shelf. If you did something embarrassing in Millbrook, you didn't get to outgrow it. You just got assigned that story for life. Someone's kid spilled punch at a school dance in 8th grade. Congratulations, you're punch kid until you're 40. I grew up there with a last name that carried weight in the smallest, most suffocating way. Not wealth, not influence, just expectations, the kind that don't come with resources, only judgment. And the thing about expectations is that they never land evenly. Ethan was 3 years older than me, and from the day he was born, the whole town seemed to decide he was proof that the Price family was doing something right. He was tall early, confident early, good at sports early. Teachers liked him. Coaches praised him. Neighbors asked about him like he was a community project everyone had invested in. He could forget his homework and it would be, boys will be boys. I could miss one question on a math test and it became a conversation about whether I was applying myself. At home, it was quieter but sharper. The little comments, the sighs, the comparisons that were always framed like they were just reality. Ethan never needed reminders. Ethan always handled pressure better. Ethan doesn't get emotional like that. The funny part is that I wasn't even bad. I wasn't a mess. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't lazy. I was a straight-A student. I worked part-time. I kept my head down and tried to become the kind of daughter my mother looked at with pride instead of mild disappointment. But no matter what I did, I could feel it, like I was always slightly misaligned with the version of me they wanted, like I was a rough draft in a family that only displayed finished masterpieces. My mother, Diane, had a way of being disappointed without raising her voice. She could stand in a doorway, arms crossed, and make you feel like you'd failed an exam you didn't even know you were taking. She wasn't cruel in the obvious ways. She was worse. She was precise. She didn't insult you directly. She edited you, corrected you, smoothed you down like a wrinkle in a dress she didn't want to be seen wearing. My father, Robert, was quieter. He wasn't the type to lash out. He just disappeared into his chair after dinner, newspaper in hand, TV humming softly, letting my mother's worldview become the only one that mattered in the house. If Diane decided Ethan was the sun, Robert became the planets, orbiting, accepting, never questioning why I always felt like the cold side of the moon. People love to say, family dynamics are complicated. Like that makes the damage gentler. It doesn't. It just makes it harder to explain. By the time I was 16, I understood something that took me years to admit out loud. I wasn't going to win in that house, not because I wasn't capable, not because I wasn't trying, but because the scoreboard was rigged. Ethan didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be Ethan. And I didn't have a name that came with automatic forgiveness. So I did what people do when they realize they're being suffocated by a place that will never let them breathe the way they need to. I left, not in a dramatic runaway way. No screaming fight, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn. I graduated high school. I saved what I could. I applied to a small community college program in the city. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make Diane brag to her friends. Then, the week after my 18th birthday, I packed one suitcase, took 2 buses and a train, and arrived with $200 in my pocket and the kind of determination that doesn't feel heroic when you're living it. It feels like survival. The city didn't welcome me with open arms. The city doesn't care about your potential. It cares about whether you can pay rent. My first apartment was a shoebox with a window that faced a brick wall. The hallway smelled like old cooking oil and wet laundry. The radiator made noises like it was arguing with itself. I ate instant noodles so many nights that I started flavoring them with hot sauce just to pretend I had variety. And you know what? I was happy. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because for the first time in my life, the air around me didn't feel like it belonged to someone else's expectations. I could fail without being compared to Ethan. I could succeed without being told it was nice, but I took whatever work I could find. Retail, waitressing, cleaning offices late at night, anything legal, anything honest, anything that kept me moving. Then, one day, I saw a job posting for housekeeping at a small boutique hotel. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a dream job. It was a paycheck and health insurance and hours that wouldn't destroy my school schedule. That's all I needed. I applied, I got hired, and I walked into that hotel's back hallways like it was just another building with beds and towels. I didn't know it was going to become my education. Hotels are strange ecosystems. Guests see the polished front, the lobby, the smiles, the soft music, the scent of expensive candles. But behind it, it's precision, it's logistics, it's timing and inventory and labor and crisis management. It's a living machine, and I was suddenly inside it. As a housekeeper, you learn things people don't realize they're teaching you. You learn how long it takes to flip a room. You learn what breaks most often. You learn what guests complain about and what they don't even notice. You learn how to move quietly and still control the space. Most importantly, you learn how money behaves when it thinks nobody is watching. I watched executives stumble in at midnight, drunk on confidence and whiskey, signing expense slips without reading them. I watched wealthy couples argue over numbers like they were emotional weapons. I watched people tip $10 like it was charity, and others tip nothing like it was principle. I watched guests treat staff as invisible until they needed something, and I remembered every detail because I was invisible too. And invisibility, when you stop treating it like a curse, becomes a weapon. I moved up fast, not because anyone gave me chances out of kindness, but because I learned systems faster than most people learned names. I was the kind of employee managers loved and co-workers sometimes resented. The one who saw problems before they became disasters. Housekeeping became front desk. Front desk became night supervisor. Night supervisor became assistant manager. At 24, I was running shifts that used to scare people twice my age. At 26, I was managing a property. I started saving like my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. I didn't buy things to impress anyone. I didn't upgrade apartments just for the view. I kept my expenses low, learned how credit worked, learned what interest rates really meant, learned how to read contracts without assuming the other person was being fair, and then I did the thing people in my old town would have called getting lucky. I bought my first small property. It wasn't a palace. It was a tired little building with peeling paint and a roof that needed work. But it was mine. I renovated it slowly, carefully, using every connection I'd made in hospitality. I increased value without increasing noise. I fixed systems. I improved service. I raised revenue. Then I bought another, then another. By 30, I wasn't just working in hotels. I was building them. I created my company quietly. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would catch attention on social media. Just paperwork, incorporation, contracts, accounts, vendors, a structure strong enough to grow without collapsing under ego. And the Monarch Hotel, the one Madison was currently using like a stage for her perfection, was my flagship, the one I poured myself into, the one I bought 3 years ago because I recognized potential where others saw risk. I signed that deed with a pen that shook just a little in my hand, not from doubt, but from the weight of what it meant, because that signature wasn't just ownership. It was proof that I wasn't a rough draft, proof that I didn't need my family's approval to become someone, which brings us to the part people always find surprising. I never told them, not once, not when I bought my first property, not when I opened my second, not when my company started turning into something real and substantial. I didn't call Diane and say, "Guess what? I did it." I didn't text Ethan a photo in front of a lobby chandelier like a trophy. Because when you grow up being underestimated, you learn a second lesson. Some people don't celebrate your success. They evaluate it. They try to claim it. They try to rewrite it so it fits the version of you they're comfortable with. So I stayed quiet, and they stayed uninterested. They didn't ask how I was doing beyond the surface-level questions people ask to be polite. They didn't ask what I did for work. Not really. They just assumed what was easiest for them to believe, that I was still struggling, still trying, still trailing behind Ethan. It was simpler that way, cleaner, less threatening, and I let them have that story because it protected what I'd built. It gave me control, and it meant that when I walked into that ballroom tonight and heard Madison's voice slice through the air with that insult, "Stinky country girl," it didn't just reveal who she was, it confirmed something else. She had no idea what she was standing inside, and neither did my family, which meant that whatever Madison was trying to do, whatever she thought she was marrying into, was built on assumptions and appearances are the easiest things to shatter. I watched the room again, the chandeliers, the champagne, the smiling faces, the careful performance. Somewhere in the noise, a clock was ticking toward the moment Madison believed would seal her future forever. She didn't know mine had already been sealed in ink 3 years ago. And tonight was going to make sure she never forgot the difference. I hadn't planned on staying long. That was the lie I told myself as I stood there, glass of champagne untouched in my hand, watching a room full of strangers celebrate a future that felt increasingly wrong. I told myself I would make an appearance, nod politely, let Ethan see that I showed up, then disappear before the night dug its hooks into me. That plan lasted exactly 3 minutes, because family has a way of finding your weak spots no matter how carefully you avoid them. I spotted my mother near the center of the ballroom, holding court the way she always did at events like this. Diane Price stood straighter when there was an audience, her voice just loud enough to carry, her laughter practiced and precise. She was surrounded by women I vaguely remembered from childhood, neighbors, former co-workers, people who had watched Ethan grow up and asked about him like he was a shared accomplishment. She hadn't seen me yet. For a moment I considered keeping it that way. Then one of her friends glanced in my direction, frowned slightly, and leaned in to whisper something. Diane followed her gaze. Her eyes landed on me, and I saw the flicker of surprise quickly replaced by something closer to irritation. She excused herself and crossed the room toward me, heels clicking sharply against the marble. She looked me up and down the same way Madison had, but without the cruelty, just disappointment. "Hannah," she said, like my name had caught her off guard. "You made it." It wasn't a question. It wasn't relief. It was acknowledgement, the bare minimum. I said hello. I said congratulations to Ethan and Madison. I kept my tone neutral, my posture relaxed. Diane's eyes lingered on my boots again. "I wish you dressed a little more appropriately," she said quietly, as if offering helpful advice instead of judgment. "Madison's family is very refined." She emphasized refined the way people do when they mean expensive. "I came straight from work," I replied, which was true. I just didn't specify that work meant overseeing a multi-million-dollar property 2 floors above us. Diane sighed, that familiar sound heavy with implication. "Well, try not to stand out too much," she said. "Tonight is about Ethan." As if I'd forgotten. She turned and drifted back into her circle without waiting for a response, already reabsorbed into her role. I stood there for a moment, staring at the space she'd just vacated, feeling something old and unpleasant crawl up my spine. It was amazing how quickly I could be transported back to being 12 years old, standing in our kitchen, being told to just let it go, while Ethan's feelings were carefully examined and protected. One conversation, less than 30 seconds, and somehow I already felt smaller. I took a slow breath and reminded myself where I was, reminded myself that the marble under my feet didn't belong to Diane's expectations, that the walls around us had never cared whether I stood out or blended in. Buildings, unlike people, are honest about what they support. That was when I saw it. The necklace. It rested against Madison's collarbone, catching the light every time she moved. An antique pendant, delicate, unmistakable, painfully familiar. My grandmother's necklace. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I leaned slightly to get a better look, my stomach tightening as recognition settled in with brutal clarity. There was no mistaking it. The oval setting, the tiny imperfection near the clasp, the chain that had been repaired once, decades ago. I knew every detail because I had held that necklace in my hands while my grandmother's fingers curled weakly around mine. She had promised it to me, not vaguely, not someday. She'd said my name. She'd said it was for me because I was her dreamer, her fighter, because she believed I would leave that town and build something of my own. Diane had been in the room when she said it. I felt the air leave my lungs. Madison laughed at something Ethan said, completely unaware of the weight she was wearing. The necklace swung gently as she moved, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been meant for her. I stared at it, heat rising behind my eyes, my chest tightening with a familiar mix of grief and anger. That necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was the one thing from my grandmother I'd asked for, the one thing that felt like proof someone in that family had seen me clearly, and my mother had given it away. I turned just in time to see Ethan approaching, his face bright, flushed with happiness. He smiled when he saw me, genuine but distracted. "Hey," he said, "I'm really glad you came." I nodded. "Congratulations." He shifted his weight, glanced back toward Madison, then leaned in slightly. "Mom gave Madison Grandma's necklace," he said, lowering his voice like it was a sweet secret. "Wasn't that generous of her? Madison absolutely loves it." The words hit harder than I expected. I managed a tight smile. "It's nice." Ethan didn't notice. He was already looking past me again, scanning the room, pulled in a dozen directions by his own engagement party. He clapped my shoulder, promised we'd talk later, and moved on. I stood there, champagne still untouched, my hands trembling just enough that I set the glass down before I dropped it. The DJ turned the music up, bass vibrating through the floor. Laughter swelled. Applause broke out near the bar as someone announced another toast. I needed air. I excused myself and headed toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, the noise fading behind me. The corridor was quieter, cooler, lit by softer lights that hummed faintly overhead. I took a few steadying breaths, pressed my palm against the wall, and tried to calm the storm of thoughts racing through my head. That was when I heard voices. They were coming from around the corner, near the service hallway, hushed but urgent. I recognized one immediately. Madison's father. His voice was low, tight with stress, the practiced warmth stripped away. He was on the phone, pacing, just out of sight. "We need this to happen," he said. "No, there's no other option. The Price family has money, enough to cover what we need." I froze. He stopped pacing, listening. Then, "We just need to get through the wedding. After that, everything stabilizes." A pause, a sharp exhale. "Yes, I'm sure. The family is solid, they can handle it." Footsteps approached. I stepped back instinctively, turning toward the restroom door just as he rounded the corner, phone still pressed to his ear, his face already rearranging itself into something calm and confident. He didn't see me. He walked past, conversation ending as he rejoined the party, his smile sliding back into place like a mask. I stood there long after he was gone, my heart pounding. The Price family has money. What money? My parents lived comfortably, sure, but I knew things they didn't advertise. I knew about the second mortgage on the house. I knew about the medical bills. I knew because I'd been quietly paying them for years. Ethan's job was stable, but unremarkable. There was no hidden fortune, no trust fund, no secret reserve. So why did Madison's father think there was? And more importantly, what exactly did they need covering? I straightened slowly, the necklace momentarily forgotten, replaced by a colder, sharper sensation. This wasn't just about a cruel comment or a stolen heirloom. Something was wrong, and whatever Madison Caldwell had walked into my family with, it wasn't love, it was a plan. I took one last breath, squared my shoulders, and headed back toward the ballroom, my mind already rearranging the night into something else entirely. The engagement party hadn't changed, but I had. And now, I needed to start paying very close attention. When I stepped back into the ballroom, nothing looked different. The music was still loud. The lights were still warm. Madison was still smiling like the world had been designed specifically for her enjoyment. If I hadn't just heard that phone call, I might have believed the illusion. But once you notice a crack, you can't unsee it. I moved slowly through the room, no longer a guest, but an observer. I let conversations wash past me, caught fragments of laughter, half-finished sentences, compliments that sounded rehearsed. My eyes kept drifting back to Madison's parents, now standing near the bar with forced ease. Her father checked his phone again, not casually, not out of boredom. He checked it the way someone does when they're waiting for bad news or praying it doesn't arrive yet. Each time he read something, his jaw tightened before he lifted his glass and smiled at whoever was nearest. Madison's mother wasn't much better. She stood stiffly, fingers constantly brushing the necklace at her throat, as if reassuring herself it was still there. She laughed too loudly, nodded too often, her eyes darting around the room like she was counting exits. This wasn't celebration behavior. This was performance under pressure. I drifted closer to a group they were speaking with, pretending to examine one of the floral arrangements. Madison's father was talking about long-term stability, about how important family values were, about how relieved he was that Madison had found a family that truly understood responsibility. Responsibility. The word landed wrong. I watched Madison herself more closely now. The way she guided conversations, the way she deflected questions about her past with vague answers and charming pivots, the way she never stayed too long with one group, like she was afraid of letting anyone look too closely. It reminded me of something I'd seen before. Guests who lied about their identity at check-in, businessmen who overstated their companies, people who built confidence out of momentum rather than truth. I'd seen enough of them to recognize the pattern. Confidence that can't stop moving is usually running from something. I made my way toward the bar and ordered a drink I had no intention of finishing. From this angle, I could see the service corridor door, a subtle spot most guests ignored, a place where staff passed in and out, where conversations slipped out accidentally. A few minutes later, Madison's father disappeared through it. So did her mother. I waited. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then I followed, far enough to see, not close enough to be seen. They stood just inside the corridor, voices low and urgent. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught pieces. Can't keep asking for extensions. If this falls apart, she doesn't need to know yet. Madison's mother noticed me first. Her eyes flicked up, sharp with alarm. The conversation stopped instantly. Like a switch had been flipped, they both straightened, smiles snapping back into place as if nothing had happened. "Oh," she said, too brightly, "enjoying the party?" I nodded politely. "It's lovely." Her father laughed. "We just stepped out for a moment and so many people." Of course, I let them pass, offering a smile that felt perfectly empty, then continued on as if I'd been headed somewhere else. My pulse was steady now. The initial shock had faded, replaced by something colder and more focused. This wasn't paranoia, this was confirmation. I didn't know what their situation was yet, but I knew enough to recognize desperation when I saw it, and desperation makes people sloppy. It makes them underestimate who's paying attention, like me. I scanned the room again, my gaze stopping briefly on Ethan. He looked happy, but there was tension in his shoulders now, a tightness that hadn't been there earlier. He laughed, but it came a fraction of a second too late. His eyes followed Madison more closely than before. He felt it too. Good. I made my way toward the edge of the ballroom near the staff entrance. A subtle nod from a server let me slip past without question. Inside the service hallway, the atmosphere shifted. Less noise, more purpose, clipboards, radios, staff moving with intent. And there he was, Graham Keller. My general manager stood near the catering station, reviewing something on his tablet. Calm, focused, exactly where he should be. He looked up when he sensed someone beside him, his professional expression softening just slightly when he recognized me. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. "Not exactly," I replied. I didn't explain yet. I didn't need to. Graham was one of the few people who didn't require a full backstory before responding. He trusted patterns. He trusted instincts. "I need information," I said, "about the Caldwell family, business records, properties, lawsuits, anything that comes up." He didn't hesitate. "How fast?" "As fast as you can." Graham nodded once, already pulling up contacts on his tablet. "I'll see what I can find." I watched him move away, already dialing, already shifting gears. There was comfort in that, knowing I wasn't alone in this, knowing the systems I'd built were about to do what they were designed to do. I stepped back into the ballroom, my mind racing now, not with emotion, but with strategy. The pieces were starting to line up, though I still didn't know what picture they formed. I glanced at Madison again. She was laughing, radiant, utterly convinced she was untouchable. She caught my eye this time and held it for a second longer than before. Her smile tightened. She knew I was watching now. Good. Let her wonder why. I took a slow sip of my drink, eyes never leaving her face, and felt something settle into place inside me. Whatever game the Caldwells were playing, it wasn't small, and they had chosen the wrong family to play it with. I just needed proof, and I was already on my way to getting it. I didn't go back to pretending after that. Once you've asked a question you can't unask, the room changes shape around you. The laughter becomes background noise. The champagne turns into a prop. The smiling faces become masks. You start reading for stress points. I kept moving, slowly, deliberately, circling the ballroom the way you circle a problem you're not ready to touch yet. My eyes returned to Madison's father again and again. He was trying too hard. He laughed when other people laughed. But his eyes never relaxed. They kept drifting toward doors, toward his phone, toward Madison like she was both his prize and his responsibility. Madison's mother was worse. She had stopped drinking. The glass in her hand stayed full, untouched, as if she needed her senses sharp. Her fingers kept playing with her bracelet. 1, 2, 3 taps, then pausing, then starting again. A small, involuntary rhythm, a tell. I had seen tells like that before in my line of work, and they always meant the same thing: pressure, a countdown inside someone's head that never stops ticking. Ethan finally approached me again, near one of the tall floral installations, his expression strained now. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You okay?" he asked. It almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, because it was late. "I'm fine," I said. He frowned, glancing past me toward Madison. "I don't know, something feels off tonight." There it was, the first crack in the golden child armor. The first moment he admitted his instincts were speaking louder than Madison's charm. "What feels off?" I asked, carefully. Ethan hesitated. "Her dad keeps disappearing. And Madison, she's weird when people ask about her college. Like she can't keep the story straight. I asked where she lived after graduation and she changed the subject. I'm probably overthinking." I held his gaze. "Maybe you're finally thinking." He blinked, like he wasn't sure if that was an insult or advice. Then he exhaled, rubbed the back of his neck, and forced a smile again as if smiling could patch holes. "I'll talk to you later," he said. "After my toast." "Sure," I replied. He walked away, and I watched him go with an ache I didn't want to name, because part of me wanted to grab him right then, pull him out of the room, sit him down, and tell him everything I suspected. Part of me wanted to protect him from whatever was coming, but protection without proof is just panic, and panic is messy. I didn't do messy. I stepped away from the crowd and moved toward the service corridor again, slipping into the quiet like I belonged there, because I did. The staff moved around me, efficient, purposeful, their attention on trays and timing and guest requests. No one questioned my presence. In my hotel, I didn't have to announce myself. The building knew me. The staff knew my rhythm. Graham Keller reappeared near the linen station, phone pressed to his ear, his face neutral in the way it always was when he was doing serious work. He spotted me and held up one finger. 1 minute. I waited, heart steady, mind sharp. When he hung up, he didn't waste time. "I found something," he said quietly. "Not enough yet, but enough to confirm your instinct." I leaned closer. "Talk to me." Graham lowered his voice further. "Madison Caldwell is hard to verify. There's no clear record trail that matches the story she's telling people. The name exists, but it's thin, recent, like it was built, not lived." A chill ran through me. Not fear, recognition. "Built," I repeated. Graham nodded. "Her father, Thomas Caldwell, has business filings, but they're messy. Lots of dissolved LLCs, addresses that don't match, and there's a civil suit in another state under a similar name. The plaintiff is an investor group claiming misrepresentation in a development deal." "Misrepresentation?" I echoed, tasting the word. "Yeah," Graham said. "And here's the part that matters. I ran a background sweep through a contact in compliance. The Caldwells are connected to a company that's currently flagged for irregular investor payouts. That usually points to one thing." I felt my stomach tighten. "A Ponzi." Graham's eyes flicked to mine. "Or something adjacent. Either way, it's not clean." The room seemed to tilt, not because I was dizzy, but because the stakes had just climbed. This wasn't just a family being weird. This wasn't just Madison being cruel. This was bigger, dangerous in the way that spreads beyond one wedding and one engagement party. And then something else clicked into place, something Franklin's phone call had hinted at. They needed this wedding to happen, not for love, for leverage. I looked back toward the ballroom through the partially open service door. Madison stood in the center of a group of guests, smiling like she was carved out of confidence. Ethan hovered beside her, still trying to believe. Diane laughed at something Madison's mother said, delighted to be included in a conversation that made her feel elevated. My family had no idea they were being positioned like pieces on a board, and I hated that. Not because I owed them forgiveness, not because Diane deserved protection, not because Ethan had ever been the kind of brother who stood between me and pain. I hated it because I understood what predators do when they think they've found a soft target. They take everything, and then they leave. Graham reached into his tablet case and pulled out a thin folder, printed pages, quick summaries, screenshots of filings, A few highlighted names and dates. Not enough to convict anyone, but enough to paint a clear outline. "Here," he said. "This is what I could pull fast. I can dig deeper, but that'll take time." I took the folder, scanning the pages. LLC names that looked deliberately generic. Addresses that traced back to mailbox services. A trail of projects that had glossy marketing but no real completion history. Investor complaints buried in legal language. A pattern that screamed one thing: they were running from consequences. I flipped a page and saw a line that made my throat tighten. A scheduled court hearing. A federal inquiry mentioned in a footnote. Not confirmed yet, but referenced. I looked up at Graham. "How sure are you?" He didn't overpromise. He never did. "I'm sure enough to say you're not imagining what you heard. They're in trouble. They're hiding it. And your brother is part of their plan." A hot, sharp anger rose in my chest. Not the kind that makes you scream, the kind that makes you precise, the kind that turns emotions into action. I stared at the folder again, mind moving fast. If the Caldwells were desperate enough to attach themselves to Ethan, that meant they believed the Price family had assets. That meant they believed there was money to access, credit to leverage, reputations to borrow, accounts to drain. But there was no family fortune. There was only me. And then another truth surfaced, heavy and unavoidable. For years, I had been sending money to my parents, quietly, anonymously, through layered accounts and corporate payments that looked like assistance rather than personal charity, mortgage help, medical bills, utility coverage when things got tight. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because leaving home didn't erase the fact that they were still my family, and I couldn't watch them sink. But they didn't know it was me. And Diane, of course Diane, had probably assumed it was Ethan, because in her world, Ethan was always the hero, always the provider, always the reason things worked out, which meant Diane had been telling people, bragging even, about her son's generosity, his success, his ability to take care of family. And Madison's family had heard it. They had done what con artists do. They listened, they researched, they targeted. My money, sent in silence, had become bait without me meaning it to. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the cold clarity settle deeper. This wasn't just about an engagement party anymore. This was about my brother's future being used as a financial lifeboat for people who were already sinking. This was about my parents being positioned as collateral. This was about Madison wearing my grandmother's necklace while her family quietly plotted to harvest whatever they believed our last name could unlock. And now I had a choice. I could do nothing. I could let Ethan marry her. Let the Caldwells reveal their true nature after the ceremony. Let my family learn the hard way what happens when you confuse charm for character. Part of me wanted that. Part of me wanted Diane to feel the humiliation of realizing she'd welcomed a lie into her home while pushing away the daughter who had been holding them up from a distance. And Ethan would survive. People survive heartbreak all the time. But survival isn't the same as safety. If the Caldwells were truly involved in fraud, Ethan wouldn't just be heartbroken. He could be legally entangled, financially destroyed, used as a signature, a co-borrower, a spouse who consented to things he didn't understand until it was too late. I could almost see it. Madison smiling sweetly as she slid documents in front of him. "Just sign here, baby. It's for us." The kind of sentence that ruins lives. I looked back toward the ballroom again. Madison tilted her head and laughed, touching the necklace like it was hers by right. Diane leaned in, smiling, delighted. Ethan watched Madison like she was the center of gravity, and suddenly, my decision became simple, not easy, simple. I wasn't going to let strangers destroy my family just because my family had been careless with me. I would expose the Caldwells. I would rip the mask off Madison Caldwell in the one place she felt safest, in front of the exact audience she was trying to impress. I would do it with proof, with structure, with consequence, and I would do it without raising my voice. I turned to Graham. I need more than this, I said, tapping the folder. I need the full picture, real records, real names if the ones they're using aren't real. I need anything that ties them to fraud. Anything. Graham nodded. I'll keep digging. And, I added, lowering my voice, I need the AV system ready, quietly. Not yet. Just be ready. Graham's eyes sharpened. For what? I didn't answer directly. I didn't have to. For the moment the room stops being a party, I said, and starts being a reckoning. He studied me for a beat, then nodded once. Professional, calm, ready. I slipped the folder under my arm, smoothed my jacket, and stepped back toward the ballroom with a different kind of composure. Madison Caldwell thought she had already won tonight. She didn't know the night had just changed hands, and the clock was still ticking. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see every single comment, and it means the world to me. Thank you so much for your support. Now, back to the story. Once the decision was made, everything inside me went quiet. That's how I've always known when I'm about to do something irreversible. The noise stops. The anger settles into something colder, sharper. The part of my brain that used to worry about being liked simply shuts down. I didn't rush back into the crowd. Rushing is what people do when they're emotional. I moved with purpose instead, slipping out of the ballroom and into the elevator bank reserved for staff. The doors closed with a soft chime, sealing me into a brief pocket of silence. As the elevator ascended, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't used socially in years, only professionally. Victoria Hale. My attorney answered on the second ring. Hannah, she said, voice crisp, already alert. This isn't a casual call, is it? No, I replied. I need you to verify something fast. Possible fraud, multi-state, real estate investments. There was a pause. Short, efficient. Send me what you have. I will. And Victoria, I added, I need to know if federal authorities are already involved. Her tone sharpened. If they are, do you want them looped in tonight? Yes. Another pause. Then, all right. I'll call you back. The elevator doors opened to the private hallway leading to my office suite. I stepped out, unlocked the door, and flicked on the lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city glittering outside, blissfully unaware of the implosion forming a few floors below. I didn't sit. I laid the folder Graham had given me across the desk, spreading the documents out like pieces of a puzzle. LLC filings, investor complaints, inconsistent addresses, half-finished projects with glossy brochures and no physical footprint. The kind of paperwork that looks boring until you understand how much damage it represents. Then I made the second call, Erin Sloan. If Victoria handled the law, Erin handled truth, the kind buried under numbers and spreadsheets. A forensic accountant with a reputation for turning complicated into undeniable. We'd worked together once on an acquisition where the seller had tried to hide losses inside shell entities. Erin had found them in under 48 hours. She picked up on the third ring. Hannah Price, she said, you never call unless someone's lying. They are, I said, and I need you to prove it. I sent her photos of the documents, one by one, pacing as they uploaded. Erin didn't interrupt. She never did. Silence was her way of thinking. Finally, she spoke. These structures are familiar. Familiar how? As in, I've seen versions of this before. Same pattern, same mistakes, investors paid with newer money, assets that exist on paper but not on land. I'll dig. How long? I asked. Give me 45 minutes, she said. Maybe less. I hung up and leaned against the desk, exhaling slowly. Downstairs, the engagement party rolled on, oblivious. Toasts clinked. Laughter spiked. A photographer corralled guests for staged smiles and posed memories. Madison was probably basking in it, soaking up admiration like oxygen, believing this night was cementing her future. I checked the time. 8:12 p.m. Franklin Caldwell's toast was scheduled for 9. That gave me less than an hour. I stepped back into the elevator, descending this time, my mind mapping contingencies. If Erin confirmed fraud, I would need corroboration. If Victoria confirmed federal interest, timing would matter. This wasn't about spectacle for its own sake. This was about consequences landing cleanly. The doors opened to the service level, and I headed toward the operations corridor. Graham was already there, speaking quietly with the AV technician. When he saw me, he excused himself and joined me near the wall. "Any luck?" I asked. "More than luck," he said. "The name Madison Caldwell doesn't exist before about 5 years ago. Before that, there's a similar face under a different name in Arizona. Same smile, same eyes." My pulse quickened, but my voice stayed steady. "Send everything you have to Erin Sloan. She's digging too." Graham nodded and tapped a quick message into his tablet. I looked around the corridor. "I'll need full control of the AV at 9. Screens, audio, everything." Graham raised an eyebrow. "You want me to cue something specific?" "Yes," I said. "Documents, court records, financial filings, photos. I'll give you the order." He didn't ask why. That's why he was my general manager. "Done," he said. I returned to the ballroom, careful to slide back into the flow like I'd never left. Madison was near the center now, laughing, her hand resting possessively on Ethan's arm. She looked radiant, untouchable. She noticed me watching and excused herself from her group. She approached like a woman who believed she had already won. "Hannah," she said brightly, touching my arm as if we were old friends. "We should talk, just us." Her grip tightened slightly, guiding me toward a quiet corner near the restrooms. The moment we were out of earshot, her smile vanished. "I know about you," she said. I tilted my head. "Do you?" She smirked. "I know you send money home every month. I know you like playing the generous daughter from a distance. Interesting. And," she leaned closer, "what I don't understand is why someone who can barely afford her own life would do that. Unless you're trying to buy their love." The words were meant to cut. Years ago, they would have. Now, they were almost funny. "Pathetic, really," she continued. "Ethan told me everything. How you've always been jealous. How the family only keeps you around out of obligation." I held her gaze, neutral, letting her talk herself into confidence. She smiled again. Cruel this time. "I'm marrying into this family. I'm becoming a price. Honestly, it would be better for everyone if you just stayed out of the way." She patted my arm and walked off. I stood there for a moment, watching her retreat, the necklace glinting at her throat. She thought I was broke. She thought the money came from Ethan. She thought she understood the hierarchy. It was like watching someone brag about their rental car to the person who owned the dealership. My phone buzzed. "Erin Sloan." I answered immediately. "You were right," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Textbook Ponzi. But that's not even the best part. Go on." "The Caldwell name has been used before. Different state, same structure, same people. Hannah, Madison isn't her real name." I closed my eyes briefly. "What is it?" "Her name is Laura Bennett, and the people posing as her parents, They're partners. This group has been running the same con for over a decade. The room felt suddenly very small. And Hannah, Erin added, there's an active federal investigation. They've been trying to locate them for months. I looked toward the center of the ballroom where Madison, Laura, stood laughing, completely unaware that the ground beneath her was about to disappear. "Thank you," I said. "Stay available." I hung up and felt something settle into place. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was exposure, and it was already in motion. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take just 1 second to drop a like and leave a comment. It really helps me keep creating these stories for you, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, let's get back to Bethany. By the time the clock on the wall behind the bar ticked past 8:50, the room had shifted in ways most people couldn't articulate yet, but they felt it. Conversations grew louder, laughter a little sharper, movements a little more restless. Anticipation always does that. It vibrates before it detonates. Franklin Caldwell straightened his jacket near the small stage where the DJ had set up a microphone. I watched him from the back of the ballroom, my posture relaxed, my hands steady, my heart completely calm. He looked confident again. That salesman's confidence that returns when someone thinks the worst has passed. He had no idea. Madison, Laura, stood beside Ethan, her hand looped through his arm like an anchor. She leaned in to whisper something that made him smile, and for a brief moment, I saw the man he could have been if this night were ordinary, if the woman beside him were who she claimed to be. But lies have weight, and they were about to collapse under their own. At 8:59, the DJ lowered the music. A hush rippled outward as glasses were raised and bodies angled toward the stage. Franklin took the microphone, his voice warm, practiced, echoing slightly through the room. "Good evening, Ben, everyone," he said. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this beautiful union." Polite applause followed. He talked about love, about family, about how honored the Caldwells were to be joining the Price family. He spoke about legacy, about shared values, about building something lasting together. Every word was polished, every sentence rehearsed, every sentence a lie. I glanced toward the control booth. Graham Keller met my eyes and gave me the smallest nod. I lifted my phone and typed a single word. Now, the screens behind the stage flickered. At first, people thought it was a glitch. The slideshow of Madison and Ethan smiling on beaches, clinking glasses, perfectly curated happiness, stuttered, then vanished. In its place appeared a document, white background, black text, official seals, a court filing. Franklin's voice faltered mid-sentence. The room went quiet, not silent, but confused. People leaned forward, squinted. Someone whispered, "What is that?" The name at the top of the document wasn't Madison Caldwell. It was Laura Bennett. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Franklin laughed nervously into the microphone. "Looks like we're having some technical difficulties," he said, turning toward the AV booth. "If someone could—" The screen changed again. Financial records, flow charts, money moving between shell companies in looping paths that didn't make sense unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. Another slide. A news article. Headline partially visible. Investors file suit in Arizona real estate scheme. Then photos. A younger woman, different hair color, same eyes, standing beside Franklin and Delilah under different names, different charity event, different state. Madison froze. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final. She stared at the screens like they might blink and disappear if she didn't move. Ethan turned to her, confusion crashing into disbelief. "Madison," he said. "What is this?" She didn't answer. Franklin backed away from the stage, his face draining of color. He tried to move toward the exit, but two members of my security team stepped smoothly into his path. That was when I walked forward. My boots echoed against the marble, each step deliberate, audible in the sudden stillness. Conversations died as people turned to follow the sound. Faces registered recognition, then confusion, then shock. Graham's voice came calmly over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce the owner of the Monarch Hotel and CEO of Price Hospitality Group, Miss Hannah Price." The room went completely still. My mother's face went white. Ethan stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Madison's eyes snapped to mine, wide with something like terror. I took the microphone from Franklin's slack hand and faced the room. "Good evening," I said. My voice carried easily. "I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you deserved to know who you were really celebrating tonight." Madison found her voice then. "She's lying!" she screamed. "She's jealous. She's always been jealous." I smiled slightly. "That's interesting," I said, "because jealousy doesn't usually come with federal case numbers." The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 4 people stepped inside, badges visible, expressions calm and unmistakably official. An agent at the front spoke clearly. "Laura Bennett, Franklin Bennett, Delilah Bennett, you are under arrest for wire fraud, investment fraud, and conspiracy," Madison screamed. Franklin tried to run. He made it 3 steps. Security restrained him as agents moved in, handcuffs clicking shut with a sound that echoed louder than the music ever had. Ethan stepped away from Madison slowly, as if the space between them had suddenly turned toxic. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice breaking but steady. "I don't know any of you." Madison lunged toward me, screaming that I'd ruined everything, that I was nobody, that I was still the stinky country girl. Security caught her before she reached me. I leaned in just enough for her to hear. "This nobody owns the room you're standing in," I said quietly, "and I sleep just fine knowing exactly who I am." They dragged her away, screaming, her perfect night unraveling with every step. I turned back to the stunned crowd and gestured to the bar. "Well," I said, "the catering's already paid for, and it seems like a shame to waste good food." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. The DJ, bless him, pressed play. The engagement party was over, but the reckoning had already landed. The next hour felt unreal, like time had loosened its grip on the room. The Bennett family, Franklin, Delilah, and the woman who had once answered to Madison, were escorted out through the service entrance in handcuffs while guests stood frozen in clusters, whispering, staring, checking their phones as if reality might correct itself if they refreshed the screen often enough. It didn't. Some people left immediately, coats grabbed in a hurry, faces tight with discomfort. Others stayed, drawn by a strange mix of curiosity and shock, lingering near the bar as if proximity to what had just happened might help them make sense of it. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, no longer invisible, no longer ignored. Eyes followed me now, some with awe, some with confusion, some with something like respect. None of it mattered the way I thought it would. What mattered was the look on Ethan's face. He found me near the bar, his shoulders slumped, his expression hollowed out like something essential had been scooped away. The confident man who had walked into the night believing he was about to marry the love of his life was gone. In his place stood someone smaller, quieter, older. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you see it before I did?" I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer would have hurt. I had seen it because I was used to being overlooked, because I'd spent years watching people closely instead of being watched myself. Because when you grow up on the outside of your own family, you learn to read rooms the way other people read weather. I paid attention, I said finally. That's all. He nodded slowly, staring at the floor. I should have listened to that feeling, he said. Something was wrong, and I kept ignoring it. Yes, I said gently. You did. Silence stretched between us, heavy but not hostile. Then he looked up at me, really looked at me, and his eyes filled. I'm sorry, he said, for everything, for not seeing you, for letting them treat you like you didn't matter. The apology wasn't perfect. It didn't erase years of being sidelined, but it was real. That's a start, I said. We stood there, two siblings who had shared a house but never quite shared an understanding, letting the truth settle between us for the first time. Diane approached next. My mother moved more slowly than usual. Her posture diminished, like the events of the evening had physically weighed her down. The woman who once commanded rooms with quiet authority now looked uncertain, almost fragile. I didn't know, she said, the words tumbling out too fast. About them, about any of this. I met her gaze. You didn't ask. That stopped her. I pulled out my phone and opened a folder I'd kept for years, bank records, payment confirmations, 4 years of transfers routed through Price Hospitality, mortgage payments, utility bills, medical expenses, every silent safety net I'd built without ever attaching my name to it. I thought Ethan was helping us, she whispered. I know, I said. That's why I never corrected you. Her mouth trembled. Tears welled, not the dramatic kind she used in public, but the quiet kind that come when a story you've told yourself for years finally collapses. It was me, I said calmly. It was always me. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as a disappointment, not as an afterthought, but as something solid, something real. Before she could speak again, a small movement near the dance floor caught my eye. Something lay on the marble, glinting faintly under the lights. The necklace, my grandmother's necklace. It must have slipped from Laura's hands during her meltdown, tossed aside like it meant nothing. I walked toward it slowly, but Ethan reached it first. He bent down carefully, as if afraid it might break, and picked it up. He turned it over in his hands, recognition dawning. This was never hers, he said quietly. It was supposed to be yours. He placed it in my palm. The weight of it felt familiar. Right, like something that had been waiting to come home. Diane watched, tears spilling freely now. I was wrong, she said, about so many things. I didn't argue. I didn't comfort her either. Some truths don't need commentary. The music shifted into something softer. The bar stayed open. Guests began to talk again, cautiously at first, then with growing animation. The shock was turning into story, the kind people would repeat for years. I took one last look at the ballroom, the melting ice sculptures, the abandoned decorations, the half-empty glasses, and felt a strange calm settle in my chest. The reckoning was over. What remained was repair, and that, I knew, would take longer. 3 weeks later, the Monarch Hotel felt like itself again. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and polished wood. The marble floors shone under morning light. Staff moved with the same quiet efficiency they always had, rolling luggage carts, greeting guests, solving problems before they could become complaints. On the surface, it was just another day in a high-end hotel, but underneath that normality, something had shifted, because now people knew my name. Not the people who mattered to my business, the vendors, the partners, the investors. They'd always known me. They'd always seen the work. But now strangers knew me too. Guests who checked in with wide eyes whispering to each other in elevators, local bloggers who tried to be subtle while taking photos of the ballroom from the lobby, people who booked a stay at the Monarch not because they loved boutique hotels, but because they wanted to stand in the room where a con artist had been exposed and arrested in the middle of a toast. The story had made the rounds faster than I expected. The headline that stuck wasn't the one about fraud or federal investigation. It wasn't the one about the charges, wire fraud, investment fraud, conspiracy, though those were plenty dramatic. No, the headline people kept sending me was the one that leaned into the insult, the one that turned it into a punchline. Stinky country girl exposes con artists at engagement party at her own hotel. I framed that one. It hangs in my office now, right beside the window that looks out over the city skyline, where the morning sun hits it just right, not because I enjoyed the mockery, but because I enjoyed the irony. Because sometimes the thing meant to humiliate you becomes the proof you survived. Franklin and Delilah Bennett, whatever their real names were, had been denied bail. Their assets were mostly smoke. Their accounts were frozen. Their investors had come forward in waves, angry and desperate and relieved, to finally have faces and fingerprints attached to the people who had stolen from them. Laura Bennett, Madison, the perfect fiancée, was in custody awaiting trial. Her attorneys tried to spin it into a misunderstanding at first, then into a conspiracy, then into silence. The evidence Erin Sloan had uncovered was too clean, too layered, too consistent. Different states, different identities, same pattern. It was the kind of case prosecutors love because it tells its own story. And the more the truth spread, the more the people who had once applauded her smile began to understand what they'd been applauding. Not love, a performance. Ethan came to see me 2 days ago. He showed up mid-afternoon, standing in my office doorway like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore, simple, practical, but his face looked different, less certain, more honest. He stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning everything, the desk, the framed hotel plans, the shelf lined with vendor contracts, the view of the city beyond the glass. He looked at my office the way someone looks at a secret room they never knew existed in their own house. "This is yours," he said quietly. "It's been mine," I replied. He exhaled a shaky laugh. "I spent years thinking I knew you," he admitted. "And I didn't. I didn't know anything." That sentence hit harder than an apology because it was the truth. We talked for a long time. Not the polite, surface-level family conversation people have at holidays. Real talk. The kind that gets uncomfortable because it pulls old memories into the light. He told me he remembered moments from childhood differently now. How Diane praised him for things he hadn't earned. How she criticized me for things that didn't matter. How he accepted it because it was easier than questioning the story he'd been handed. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. "I just didn't think." "I know," I said. And somehow, that was both the problem and the beginning of the fix. We went to lunch afterward. Not a family obligation lunch where everyone chews carefully and avoids the truth. A real lunch where Ethan asked me questions like he actually wanted the answers, about how I built my company, how I learned, how I survived those first years, how I didn't quit when the city tried to chew me up and spit me out. He listened, not politely, actually listened. That mattered. Diane started therapy. She told me on the phone last week, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Not weak, just stripped of performance. "I want to understand why I did what I did," she said. "Why I treated you like you weren't enough." For a moment, I didn't know what to say, because part of me wanted to punish her with silence, the same way she'd punished me with dismissal. Another part of me, older, calmer, understood that even late effort is still effort. So I said, "Take it slow," and she did. She didn't ask for forgiveness immediately. She didn't try to buy her way back into my life with guilt or gifts. She just showed up differently, called occasionally, asked how I was, and actually waited for the answer. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a movie ending, but it was something. This morning, I hosted a business breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Investors, partners, regional managers. The usual polished conversation about expansion, quarterly projections, staffing plans, long-term strategy. People in tailored suits sipping coffee like it was a ritual. Halfway through the meeting, the hostess approached me quietly. "Miss Price," she said, "there's someone here to see you." She looks nervous. I excused myself and walked toward the lobby. A young woman stood near the entrance, clutching a folder to her chest like it was armor. Her clothes were simple, her hair pulled back, her eyes wide as she took in the lobby's elegant calm. She looked like she was trying to disappear into the plants, and then I heard it. One of the investors, Gerald, a man with too much money and not enough manners, had followed me out, curiosity on his face. He looked at the young woman and said, loud enough for her to hear, "Is she lost? This is a private event." The words hung in the air, not identical to Madison's insult, but close enough in spirit to make something cold flicker inside me. The young woman's cheeks flushed. She tightened her grip on the folder. Her shoulders curled slightly inward, the instinctive posture of someone who has learned that being small sometimes feels safer. I didn't look at Gerald. I walked straight to the young woman and extended my hand. "Nicole," I said warmly. Her eyes flicked up, surprised. "Yes," she whispered, unsure. I smiled. "I'm so glad you could make it." I turned, projecting my voice without raising it. "Everyone," I said, "I want you to meet Nicole Harper, this year's recipient of the Price Hospitality Scholarship." Gerald went still. The lobby went quiet in that subtle way rooms do when social hierarchies change in real time. I continued, calmly. "Nicole grew up in a small town. She worked 2 jobs through community college. She's starting Cornell's hotel management program this fall." Nicole's eyes widened, stunned by the sudden attention. I guided her toward the restaurant where my investors sat, still holding the air of entitlement like it was a title. I pulled out a chair at my table, in my hotel, and invited her to sit right beside the people who thought they owned the room simply because they'd bought expensive suits. Nicole lowered herself into the chair slowly, as if afraid she'd be corrected. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Thank you." I shook my head. "Don't thank me yet," I said quietly. "The real work is just starting." Then, a little softer, I added, "And if you ever feel like you don't belong somewhere, remember this. The people who build the most beautiful things usually start with nothing but stubbornness and a plan." Her lips trembled into a small smile. Later, after the breakfast ended, I stood in the lobby and watched the flow of guests like I always did. Business travelers rolling suitcases, couples checking out, families asking directions, people moving across floors I owned, beneath lights I chose, through a building shaped by decisions I made. Most of them didn't know who I was, and that was fine. I didn't need recognition from strangers. I needed something else. I needed to know that the version of me Diane dismissed, the version Madison mocked, the version Ethan overlooked, that girl from a small town with cheap boots and a quiet voice, had turned every insult into structure, because people will always try to make you feel small for where you came from. Let them. While they're busy looking down on you, they won't see you rising, and by the time they finally do, you'll already own the room.